All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Housing Up's summer Seat at the Table event. What is affordable housing anyway? I'm Christina Pei, Vice President of Philanthropy and Communications at Housing Up. And Housing Up is a DC nonprofit that has been building thriving communities and developing affordable housing and providing services to homeless and low-income families since 1990 here in the district. So I think we all know affordable housing is a term that pops up so often in news and politics. We know that affordable housing is important and that DC has a particular need for more of it. More than 60% of DC residents are rent burdened, meaning that they spend more than half of their income on rent. And so as one of the nation's most expensive housing markets, the need for affordable housing has really only been exacerbated by the pandemic and various social changes. So I'm very glad to be joined today by these experienced panelists to talk a little bit more about how affordable housing actually works here in DC, who funds it, who develops it, and who benefits from it. So joining me today, first we have Victoria Melendez. She is a program officer at LISC DC. Victoria works directly with nonprofits like Housing Up and small businesses to build their capacity. Victoria came to LISC from Unidos US, where she pursued just and equitable economic policy as a senior economic policy analyst. Victoria holds bachelor's degrees from the University of Florida and a master's degree from Northeastern University in Boston. Thank you for joining us today, Victoria. Up next, we have IK Emo, the Senior Vice President of Multifamily Lending and Neighborhood Community Investments at the DC Housing Finance Agency. At Senior Vice President, IK oversees the multifamily and lending team, serves as chief underwriter, and is responsible for developing business opportunities and managing the agency's pre-development construction pipelines. IK joined the agency in 2020 and previously served as the director of DC HFA's Housing Investments Division, where he was responsible for the development of new housing investment products and financing initiatives. Thank you for joining us today, IK. Up next, we have Sasha Gay Angus, who is the president and CEO of MANA DC. Sasha is a leader of affordable housing and community development with over 20 years of experience in rebuilding communities for low-income individuals, families, and seniors. She has led multiple projects resulting in over $350 million of investment in affordable and mixed income communities. In 2020, she joined MANA as president and CEO, and she currently serves as secretary on the board of directors of the Housing Association of Nonprofit Developers. Sasha earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science and a public administration from Fisk University and holds a master's degree in public administration from the University of Pittsburgh. Thanks for joining us today, Sasha. And finally, we have Jack Carey, development director at Wynn Companies. Jack, during his career, he has managed the creation of over 2,500 affordable rental and owner-occupied units and has secured over $300 million in financing from Section 8 to FEMA. Recently, Jack helped create a partnership between Wynn Henley Elementary School, the Washington Nationals Youth Baseball Academy, and local universities to link low-income residents of 3 Wynn properties with many educational and cultural facilities throughout Washington, DC. Glad to have you here today, Jack. So let's dive right in. I'm going to open it up to all of you to chime in with your thoughts and perspectives. So like I said before, we talk a lot about affordable housing in DC, from new projects to funding to the increased need. But the term is often used in a number of different ways. To some, it might mean public housing. To others, it means housing set aside for low-income residents. So let's just get the terminology cleared up. When we talk about affordable housing, what do we really mean? Why is it so needed in DC? And most importantly, who does it benefit? Anyone want to dive right in?
Sure, I can get us going. I think it's really important to look at affordable housing as a continuum because it's really about what can you afford. And typically affordability is determined by not spending more than 30% of your income on housing. And so what that income is determines things. You know, you can't quite have 30% of zero. And so when we really think through affordability, that spans a really broad range, from 0% AMI, which, backing up a bit, area median income, or AMI for short, is, if you take all of the whole number of like least amount of income to most, what's in the middle in our area. And that's kind of like the number that's determined. And so anything from 0 to 80% of that middle number in our district is what it's based upon. And so that's just like, the really like textbooky kind of definition. But within that, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of housing, right? Like there's permanent supportive housing, which is really neat, providing like holistic wraparound care, often to folks who have experienced homelessness. There's limited equity cooperatives, which is a way of like maintaining housing affordability and through, joint ownership of a property. And there's different government subsidies. And so it's a lot of different things that exist to meet different levels of need across the whole spectrum.
Sure, that's great.
I'll jump in here, Christina. I think it's a great question about what is affordable housing, and I think Victoria did it, explained it well. I just want to add that it's important to sort of demystify the negative connotation that comes with affordable housing. Oftentimes, as you mentioned, that people think of affordable housing being Section 8 when it's really not. It's a Section 8 may be one form of affordable housing, but in layman's terms, it's really about creating housing that's attainable to people. It's that it's attainable to people who aren't wealthy, who have less choices, who need to spend, no more than 30% of their income toward housing, and especially if they have transportation costs associated with that. If they have a car, transportation costs can be the second highest expense for most households next to housing. And so it's important that access to housing is attainable for working families. And so that's really what we're talking about in a sort of a layman's terms. And there are many different ways to achieve affordable housing. And we'll get into that later on. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction. I'm glad you talked about that, the stigma around not just affordable housing, but also, services and resources. I think that's something that we all deal with and see often in our work. I want to jump back to Victoria for a quick minute. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the function of LISC and your role there? We, of course, have worked together for a couple of years now. LISC supports so many nonprofit affordable housing developers and affordable housing development in general in the city. So, what do you do at LISC? And, what kind of projects do you usually see being submitted and considered for funding?
That's a really great question. I think like one of the easiest places to start is kind of breaking down the words we use to describe ourselves. We are a community development financial institution. And so again, one of those like alphabet soup situations, CDFI gets thrown around a lot, but what does it mean? And it means that we exist to uphold our community. We are able to take risks that other, financial institutions, certain banks might not take. And we have really deep ties in our neighborhoods. We've been around for 40 years here in DC. We actually have our anniversary this year. So, keep your eyes peeled for us and how we'll be celebrating. And also shout out to Nana, who's also been around 40 years. So that's really neat. But with that in mind, we exist to help our communities be stronger by connecting with the talent and the know-how that already exists, right? Like people know what they need. And so we connect with local leadership that already has, connections, like they know Joe down the street, they know like everyone down the block, and they know what the opportunities are and the areas to intervene. And so we come behind organizations in a few ways. We have 4 main ways, and those are lending, grant making, technical assistance, and convening. And to kind of break those down, lending might look like, maybe an acquisition loan to someone like Housing Up or Mana to be able to purchase a property to maintain affordability. Grant making could look like, and we can talk about this later on, but I do a lot around HUD Section 4, which is capacity building. And so the way I explain that is like, everyone wants to fund books for the book drive, but no one wants to like pay for the human being that has to hand these out and feed their family. And so there's a lot of like unglamorous work behind the scenes that, might seem irrelevant, but is like critical to getting things done, like hugely important to getting things done. And so we fund that work, and that is meant to increase what nonprofits are capable of. And so sometimes that's within an organization, like, are we granting to help an entity, be able to cross their T's and dot their I's appropriately. And also it might be programmatic capacity. We give grants, like, let's say you're starting something new and you need a staff person to do that. The other 2 areas are, our convening power. We have brought a lot of folks together as a result of being around for so long. And so, often you hear something, you're like, oh man, if you just knew this person, y'all could work so well together. And so we're really great at making those connections. We are a national organization, and so those connections can, span the country. And technical assistance is, I think the simplest way of explaining that is kind of free consulting. A lot of our partners have varying degrees of capacity, and sometimes they just need, to walk through a certain problem and be pointed to some solutions on a kind of one-on-one level. And we tend to do all of these, we do them individually, we do them in tandem, you can have any combination of this kind of support with us. But yeah, the heart behind what we do is how do we make this community stronger by leveraging immediate neighborhood know-how, and that's what we try to plug in.
Absolutely. Going to bounce over to IK now, and Victoria mentioned, Section 4 funding and funding from HUD. So that kind of handles the federal portion of funding. And then, in your role at DCHFA, what role does DCHFA play in development and funding? And has, the pandemic shifted any of DCHFA's goals and priorities over the past couple of years?
So I think starting from the end of the question, if anything, the pandemic has reinforced our goals and what we're working towards as an agency. Simply put, HFA is a capital provider in the marketplace. That's our mission. As Chris Donald would say, we are a bank with a mission. Within the development cycle, 2 bands, right? You have homeownership and you have rentals. The bulk of HFA's business really is around providing tax-exempt bond financing to projects. What this means is if you can get a bank loan at 5% coming to HFA, you might be able to get between 50 basis points, call it 4.5% to about 4% for the same loan. It has the effect of being able to provide not just cheaper capital, but it means that the district as a whole can save on more subsidies that could then apply to more projects generally. Secondarily, and just as importantly, HFA also has a single-family home program where we provide capital within the single-family home ownership space. And within that realm, we define affordable housing or workforce housing, at least in the space, to go up to 120% AMI. So this will be for a family of 4 earning just, I think now it's $115,000 a year. Given the average cost of owning a home in the city, a single individual at that amount could not afford an $800,000 home. So we find ways to not just provide capital, but also enhance the supply of affordable housing, single family homes that are affordable in the district through that program.
Sure. I just want to kind of talk about, we've talked a lot about stigma and making sure that affordable housing is accessible to all. And I think we all know in DC, oftentimes, people of color, families of color are the most, not just in DC, it's a national thing, but are the most impacted by those lack of access to affordable housing. So, how does racial equity and making equitable opportunities for everyone here in DC play into what HFA does?
It's a big part of what we do, and I think this goes in alignment with the city's executive, trying to create more equity across all 8 wards in the district. I will use our HIP program as an example. In our HIP program, effectively, let me take a step back data-wise. There are about 150,000 single-family homes plus townhomes in the district. That's our housing stock defined. On an annual basis, about 10,000 of those homes flip. There's significantly more demand for that 10,000, which means that the costs of buying a home, regardless of the market environment, the macro environment, continues to rise. So one of the ways we've sought to play a role in the marketplace outside of providing cheaper capital, which just sort of raises what it costs to buy a home, because effectively, the cheaper the capital, the more home or the more expensive the home you can buy for the same dollars. We determined in the district, if you look at the last 10 years, there's been a loss of citizenry in the district. However, that loss mostly occurs in the middle. So families that are earning above $150,000 continue to move into the district. Families that are earning below 30% of the AMI continue to move in the district. But the middle income earner is moving out of a district to find more housing, to find more space. That's your couple that has one child or a couple that are getting married and need to move into a bigger abode. We try to solve the problem by partnering with developers, purchasing land, actually building those homes at below market rate and selling them comparatively at below market rate. To your question of equity, the way we've looked to build equity, I think in our pipeline, we have a little over 100 housing units available for sale, of which 35 have been delivered. Of that 35, 34 of them have been sold to families of color, right? That's our way of granting equity and trying to help minorities build equity within the larger marketplace.
Great, thank you. It's good, really good to know that actual work is being done to make housing more, home ownership more available and a possibility. Speaking of home ownership, Sasha, I think often when people hear the term affordable housing, they think in terms of rental housing and not necessarily home ownership, right? So we have IK talking about what HFA is doing to kind of make home ownership more of an opportunity for families. So how does MANA approach affordable housing, through that lens of home ownership? And what challenges exist here in DC for that, family with one kid trying to stay in the district and buy a house?
Sure. So first and foremost, MANA is, we're a 40-year-old organization. We're a nonprofit developer of affordable rental and ownership housing. We're a condominium and homeowner association manager, and we're also a HUD-approved housing counseling agency. So we take a comprehensive approach to addressing the barriers to home ownership. And we know that some of the barriers to home ownership are, education, counseling, understanding all of the programs, such as those that are run by HFA and others. But one of the biggest barriers that we're seeing from the data is also affordable inventory. While there may be, a significant number of townhomes available in the district, they are not staying on the market long enough, and they flip very quickly within a matter of days. In my neighborhood in Ward 5, I read something that the average home stays on the market less than 11 days. And that's just astounding for a buyer that needs to utilize programs to become a first-time home buyer. So Mana's approach is comprehensive in that we try to, number one, address the barrier of inventory. Housing production of affordable home ownership is just a big issue in the district. And so as developers, we try to create as many owner occupied units as we can. And with that, we also have a very robust housing counseling agency that provides homebuyer education, various workshops. We administer the 8-hour home buying class that's required to participate in certain programs, et cetera. And so we're taking a comprehensive approach of that is people-centered, so investing in people to prepare them for home ownership, but also place-based, where we're really sort of, trying to address affordable housing, not just from a rental housing standpoint, but creating, long-time homeowners that will, want to stay in the neighborhood, that will take care of the neighborhood, and that will have the opportunity to build assets and long-term create stability and wealth for their families.
That's great. So are there any,
Christina,
go
sorry, if
Sure.
I might add, the work that folks like Sasha and Mana are doing, we call it the Lord's work, because it's critically important to understand it's not enough to own a home, right? There are components that come with owning a home, financial education. It's being able to stay in a home and really build equity. Buying the home is just the first step. So
Right.
organizations like them are key to what the rest of us try to do, which is really build equity across the district.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that, we've seen, I was actually about to ask you this, Sasha, trends of home ownership here in DC, especially for, communities of color. I feel like, just as a layman, I feel like we know that percentage of families owning homes in the districts has declined over the past few years. So are there any other trends that you've noticed in your work?
Sure. I think that what we're seeing is that I can start with myself. I purchased my first home in Washington, D.C. in 2006. I thankfully, because of homeownership, I was able to, my cost of housing was stable. I went through many different life changes and transitions, but I'm still in that home. And when I ask myself, do we have the opportunity to purchase? Yes. Are the obstacles there for purchase? Absolutely. 100%. And so one of the things that we're seeing with our families at Mana is that over 75% of the first-time buyers that we serve, and most of the people we serve are first-time home buyers, over 75% of them remain in the home. Some of the other trends that we're seeing that's not so positive is that of the homes that are on the market, only about, the average Black person who's purchasing a home in Washington, D.C. can only afford 10% of those homes that are on the market. Whereas the average white person with the average wealth of a white person in the district can afford 67% of those homes. So what that's telling us is that, number one, there is a disparity in terms of income, number one, but there are some issues around access to home ownership, as well as the cost of, home prices. We're seeing home prices skyrocket in the district. The average cost for a 3-bedroom home is about, $650,000 to $700,000, and that depends on the neighborhood.
Right.
Neighborhoods that are neighborhoods of choice, that price could be far more. And so, one of the things that I'm happy that's occurring is that the district and the mayor currently has created this Black homeownership fund, and that is to address to improve access to homeownership in the district, because we're really seeing the homeownership rate decrease in the district. We're losing so many of our long-term residents to other adjacent counties.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. A question to everyone. DC is unique in so many different ways. So, what kind of particular opportunities and challenges exist here in terms of funding and developing affordable housing and kind of increasing home ownership?
Well, I would say to the people that are listening, the way to get involved in this is to do it, right? And the place you always start with housing, as with any real estate, is the location. So think through so the first thing is coming up with sites, which is for a developer always the most difficult thing to come up with and control that site. But there are lots of possibilities. One that's starting to happen here are there a number of churches, excuse me, especially African-American churches, which have had many of their flock move out to Ward 9 to Prince George's County. And therefore, they're sitting on a lot of land. And many of them has, as part of their objective, providing housing. The second thing that is just beginning, and we're just seeing the beginning of it, is what's going to happen to all that office space that has been developed, especially in downtown, when all of us are sitting at home on Zoom calls instead of being in the office or having conferences. And I don't think that that's going to go away for a lot of reasons. So first thing is finding the sites, finding and the district. If you find a site and you find one that is either zoned for housing right now or can be rezoned, the city will jump over backwards. The city and everybody else, LISC and everybody else, will jump over backwards to help you put the pieces together to get the housing built for all the reasons that other people have talked about.
Sure. Anyone else want to chime in?
Sure. Oh, wait, you go ahead, Sasha.
No, please. I'll go after you.
Okay. Well, I think that I kind of want to add another layer to this, in that affordable housing isn't just about development, but also about preservation. And I think that's pretty critical. I mean, on a national level, we're about 7 million affordable housing units away from where we need to be. Like we're missing 7 million affordable units to meet the current need. And then on top of that, we're at risk of losing 6 million more. And the reason for that largely is because of home health hazards. And so one particular challenge in DC is that we have a lot of aging housing stock. And, a lot of housing predates 1978, which is the year that lead paint became outlawed. And so there are a lot of home health risks and touching on what everyone here in this conversation has explained so far, but this is about like a whole ecosystem of care, right? The whole system, and having a home that is healthy. And so some barriers to even like accessing programs can often be, does your house meet certain health criteria, meet certain rules and regulations, and getting there can be really expensive. And so that's like one piece of the affordable housing puzzle, is how do we help folks take the steps they need to do to stay inhabiting their home? Like we worked with an entity that literally their roof was hit by lightning, like their chimney obliterated by lightning. Like I couldn't make this up, and that's something that like you need a roof. And then the roof, if it's damaged, it's going to cause mold's going to cause asthma, and it's a whole thing. And when we, go back to the question about race, we know that like Ward 8 is predominantly Black. And we also know that the majority of asthma hospitalizations come from Ward 8. So like children are at risk of home health hazards. Like this is, and that raises a question, like, is housing a market good or a fundamental human right? And like, are people able to focus on school? Like lead causes brain damage, like asthma can cause death. These are really serious concerns that we can't take lightly. And so like one layer I want to add to this discussion is like affordable housing. Like we also have to call it like quality affordable housing, because people can pinch pennies together and live in what might essentially like be harmful housing, or are we really making sure that we work together to keep existing housing affordable and keep it high quality, bring it to a certain standard, and then when we are developing housing, are we making sure that to Jack's point, that it's close to things that are important. We also do some work at LISC around, economic development. We're looking into helping with different food systems. We've done work around schools. Like it's all about the whole neighborhood. And so I think taking that perspective. So I just wanted to like, a bee for your bonnet is, I think, adding quality to the mix is pretty critical.
Absolutely. And Sasha, were you gonna?
I just want to add a brief point that, the issue of really sort of, creating attainable and affordable housing, the issues are gonna vary depending on, what city that you're looking at. But for Washington, D.C., the opportunity is that we have, there are resources available, through CDFIs like LISC, HFA. The District of Columbia has a very robust housing production trust fund. That's where they're leading amongst other cities in committing to housing production trust fund. At the same time, the challenge is that from a development standpoint, that we are in a high cost market. We are in what's called a very hot market. And so, land costs, just that first cost to obtain site control, particularly, in a private market transaction, can be very, very expensive and can make the difference between being able to make your numbers work, or not being able to make your numbers work. And so that speaks to, what tools are available to make your numbers work. And we know that historically, there are a lot more tools available to create rental housing. The federal government created the Community Reinvestment Act in 1968, I believe, that allowed for financial institutions to, invest in certain areas, and in return they receive credits on certain liabilities that they may have. And so there are lots of tools, and there have been tools in place for rental housing for decades. And so what we'll see in the district is that the tools that are available allow us to create more rental housing, despite the fact that we're in a very high cost market. There are still some very good tools available to create, owner occupied housing. HPAP, for example, offers significant down payment assistance, but closing cost is still a challenge, right? So imagine purchasing a home for $600,000, and you've got to come up with, closing costs. That may be 5% of that amount. There are families with generational wealth that can maybe go to mom and dad and say, hey, can you loan me some money, or can you grant me some money to fund this closing costs for this first home? But then there are other families that do not have generational wealth due to systemic, historical practices that have stripped, wealth from those, those households. And so coming up with a closing cost might be a challenge. For individuals trying to obtain home ownership. So while there are tools available, and the Washington DC is definitely leading in terms of its public and private participation in creating affordable housing, we have the unique challenge of being in a great city where, there are a lot of opportunities, there are jobs available. But it is also very, very expensive. And so we've got to do a little bit more to begin to really move the needle, to help those who are, for all the rental housing that we're creating, we have to consider that maybe even just a small percentage of those people may want to move into home ownership. And how can we improve access to allow that to occur?
Absolutely. I think access is such a key word. I think we all talk about access and availability all the time. So go ahead. Sorry, IK or Victoria.
So I was just going to contextualize what Sasha said around cost to build, because sometimes we have these conversations without putting some figures around it, both for rental housing and for homeownership. As an example, we have a project, Delta Towers, that was delivered just last year. When that project was put into the system, the cost to build that project in totality was just around $550,000 a door. And that was a rental housing project that spanned from 30% AMI to, I think, 60% AMI. So very lower end. Today, if you were to build that same project according to the guidelines, the same cost is about $750 a door. So that's a 100-unit project that is $200,000 across 100 units. That's a significantly more expensive project. That's a $20 million more expensive project. So yes, the district has a lot of resources, but what we find, because we are in a high cost environment, that number of resources does not equate to the same number of units. Even in our home ownership program, so we began our HIP program in 2017. In 2017, the deals we underwrote were looking at the cost to build for a single family home around $250, between $250 and $278 per door, $1,000 to just build the home. Back then, you could buy land in Ward 8 and Ward 7 for between $10,000 to $15,000 a door. That same parcel of land today costs anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000 a door, depending on who's selling. And to build that same structure, our typical build is about 3-bedroom, 2-bath home for a family is north of $400,000 per home. So you put that together, and we say it's expensive to build, and you're selling the home for $612,000, what have you. It's not because the folks on the other side are greedy. It's just the materials expenses, the cost to put together the home, the folks who are doing the work, all those people in the value chain to create that housing have to be compensated one way or another, which just makes it more expensive. To Sasha's point, there are various forms of down payment assistance the city provides and subsidy financing that the city provides, but that just gets you at barely meeting the base to get a home in the city. There are other ways with the cooperatives to sort of provide, but they have their upsides and downsides. But I hope that sets the table for the participants around the conversation of it is expensive to build in the city, and the more resource you pour to it, the expenses do not plateau, at least as far as we've seen today.
Right. The other point that I would like to add, if I may, is that the tension between the people who are providing the funding, who are necessarily doing their due diligence, trying to be honest brokers of the dollars that they control, and therefore setting these are the limits to which we'll make loans, that tension, and the market, which is where the developers, whether they're for-profit or not for-profit, are dealing every day, is not going to go away. That's always going to be there. And that's okay. That's part of what we have to do. we have to learn how to wend our way through all of that. What you don't want to have happen, which has happened and which has me somewhat concerned when I see some of the things that have been built, is you don't want that tension to result in building housing that was where the sources define the uses, right? Like everybody that's in the development business has always heard the expression sources and uses. I always thought that the expression should be uses and sources, that what comes first is what are you building? What are the uses? And what's the level of quality there? And you don't let the sources, although they always do, unfortunately, define the uses, or you'll wind up with crummy housing. And then you wind up with, all the problems of bad housing, and the public perception that, gee, all this money is wasted and in part because it wasn't invested, the right decisions weren't made in the first place.
Mm.
So to those of you who represent the public, when you see Wynn coming through the door saying we need more money, we're not kidding. We do need the additional funds, and I'm sure that's true with Manon and anybody else that's developing. But that tension is always going to be there, and that tension there's nothing wrong with that tension. It's good. What we don't ever want it to have happen, though, is to build bad housing because that's all somebody said we could afford. Because we really can't afford bad housing. In the end, it costs you a lot more than building it right the first place.
Yep. I don't want to cut this short, but we do have some questions from the audience. And I know we're kind of nearing in on closing time. So do you all face significant community opposition to affordable housing development, particularly large scale developments? And if so, how do you respond? How do you kind of navigate what is needed in a community versus a community's kind of response to affordable housing being built?
I'll start by saying that I'll just talk about my professional experience over the last 20 plus years. Absolutely, as a developer, in my former life, now, in my current role at Manna, wearing both the developer hat, but also leading an organization and really, trying to be a voice for change, for the clients that we serve. Never go into someone's community thinking that you have all the answers is a mantra that I try to take. That we go into a community with, the expertise of understanding how to get it done, having a concept of what a plan might look like, but really, seeking feedback and input from the community about, what they would like to see, with new housing, and particularly if it's housing that is, funded in partnership with the government. You're not going to be able to please everyone in that community, and I like to really be clear about that you're not everyone's hopes and dreams are going to be met, because that can be impossible. And there can be even conflicts among, neighborhood residents in terms of what the vision is for that community. But the hope would be to see where the, similarities and consensus lies in terms of, of what the vision might be, but and really grounding that with what the developer has, available, what the tools are, what are they required to build, and so it can be an interesting tension where maybe not everyone gets what they want, but the important thing is that you know, people are getting something, that their voices are heard, that you know, the fundamental issues are being addressed through you know, a process that involves, you know, stakeholder feedback and engagement.
Thank you for that. I think we'll take one more question. I think we just saw in the chat, if you asked the questions, since we are running a little short on time, we will make sure to get answers to them in the follow-up email along with the recording of the Zoom. So thank you for the people who have sent in the questions. So one last question before we wrap up. You know, can you please talk about any programs that support families trying to stay in their home? This can be impossible given property taxes.
You mean especially staying in owner-occupied housing?
Yes.
Well, we know how to do that, and we've done that historically in a number of different ways. We've had programs like the 312 loan program, the 115 grant program. We've run large-scale rehabilitation projects for which the district has done as well. We have extensive experience in how to do that. Maybe this is the way we ought to start thinking about this. In Biloxi, Mississippi, after Hurricane Camille and other places, we provided hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to existing homeowners. And so that we should look to what we've already done. And that gets to the question of preservation that was raised earlier, that would start preserving houses and start providing people with the money that they need to make the necessary repairs so that they're not forced to either sell, or this doesn't happen anymore, but it did in the district, to actually abandon housing. So we know how to do this. And so the way to do it is to take some of the funds that are available and make them available to existing homeowners to fix up where they live right now. But also, I think to recognize that the market to some extent is going to operate, right? So if you're living in a home and you've been living there for 30 or 40 years and you bought it years ago for $80,000 or $90,000 and it's suddenly worth $500,000 or $600,000, you're not only going to be tempted, logic would say, yeah, you may well wind up selling that house. And it's unlikely that you're going to care the color of the skin of the person that's buying the house, as opposed to the color of the money that they're paying you for the house. So that's going to happen too.
Christina, if I could just add, since we're running up on time.
Yes, go ahead.
That thank you for those comments, Jack. On the owner-occupied side, very simple. If you're running into trouble, it can be overwhelming and you want to stay in your home, please you can go to the HUD website, www.hud.gov, and look for the nearest HUD certified counseling agency in your jurisdiction. HUD lists all the certified counseling agencies in every state and city. MANA is a HUD certified housing counseling agency that can offer foreclosure prevention. One of the important aspects of working with a HUD certified counseling agency, if you're facing the possibility of foreclosure, is that person becomes an advocate for you. So they really don't have any interest in it except to help you stay in your home, and they can help you navigate the various programs that are available to prevent foreclosure. So please do not underestimate the importance of reaching out for help to allow you to stay in your home.
Thank you, Sasha. I think we'll end on that very helpful and useful bit of advice. Thank you to everyone who attended. Again, I said, keep asking those questions. We'll follow up in a follow-up email along with the recording. And thank you even more so to all of our panelists. I think this was really informative and a great conversation. So with that, we'll give you your afternoon back and hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.